In February 2019, a heart stopped beating in a quiet hospital in North Carolina. There were no cameras, no grieving fans outside the gates, no trending hashtags. In fact, the world didn't even know he was gone. Until 30 days later. Thous. Think about that. One of the highest paid men in the history of television, a man whose face once defined the very concept of American masculinity, died in such total silence that it took a month for the news to reach the public. His name was Jan-Michael Vincent. But if you turn back the clock to the 1,980 seconds, his name was synonymous with lightning. He was the Alpha, the sun-drenched god of the Pacific, and he had a twin, a man who shared his golden hair, his restless blue eyes, and his throne at the top of the Hollywood mountain. Patrick Swayze. To the public, they were the same myth. Two kings of the surf, two icons of the action screen, two men who seemed to possess the secret of eternal youth. But today, we look behind the neon glow of the 80s to reveal a smoking gun of destiny. We are going to compare two lives that started at the same finish line, but ended in two completely different universes. While one man would fight a public battle with legendary dignity, protected by a fortress of love, the other would be devoured by his own shadow, dying so quietly that the world forgot he was even breathing. Why does Hollywood preserve the legacy of one man while erasing the other? Is a good death the ultimate prize of a life well lived? Or is the industry simply a machine that wrings out its stars, only to discard the ones who break too easily? This is the comparative tragedy of Jan-Michael Vincent and Patrick Swayze. One kept the light until the very last breath. The other let the light go out while the heart was still beating. In the late 1,970 seconds, Hollywood fell in love with a very specific kind of man. He was lean, sunburned, and restless. He didn't talk much. He moved like someone who trusted his body more than his words. On screen, he looked like freedom. Off-screen, he was treated like a force of nature. Jan-Michael Vincent broke through first. In 1,978's Big Wednesday, he wasn't just acting, he was the soul of a generation. He was the James Dean on a longboard. He had a quiet, brooding intensity that made every frame feel heavy. Studios didn't market his characters, they sold his presence. Then came Patrick. Swayze arrived with a different energy, a dancer's grace combined with a brawler's grit. By the time he played Bodhi in Point Break, he had inherited the crown. Both men represented a version of masculinity that felt untouchable, athletic but emotional, tough but beautiful. As the industry describes it, they looked like men who belonged outdoors on waves, on motorcycles, in motion. Audiences didn't just admire them. They projected their own dreams of freedom onto them. But myths are expensive to maintain. Behind the sunlit frames and slow-motion shots, the pressure was already forming. Fame didn't arrive gently. It arrived fast, loud, and absolute. And, in Hollywood, when something works, it is pushed until it breaks. 1,984 versus 1,987. These were the years they became immortal. Jan-Michael Vincent was earning $250,000 per episode for Airwolf. In today's money, that's nearly $750,000 a week. He was the most powerful man on television. He flew a supersonic helicopter into the living rooms of millions. He was the apex predator of the airwaves. Meanwhile, Patrick Swayze was taking a massive risk on a small-budget film that every major studio had passed on, a movie called Dirty Dancing. One was at the absolute summit. The other was just beginning a dangerous climb. But if you look closer at the footage from those years, you can see the divergence. Look at Jan's eyes in the third season of Airwolf. There is a distance there, a fatigue. The pressure of being the Adonis was already crushing him. He began to treat his body like a playground, testing its limits with substances and late nights. Patrick, on the other hand, was a workaholic. He believed his body was a temple that had to be disciplined, refined, and controlled. Jan relied on raw, volatile instinct. Patrick relied on a dancer's structure. One was a storm that couldn't be contained. The other was a river that chose its path. Success has a way of disguising warning signs as personality traits. For Jan-Michael Vincent, his volatility was treated as creative fuel. If he arrived late, it was waved off as genius. If he pushed back, it was passion. But behind the scenes, the alcohol was no longer a party guest, it was the master of the house. He didn't just drink to celebrate, he drank to disappear. For Patrick, the first crack came in 1982 when he lost his father. It sent him into a spiral too. He struggled with the bottle, just like January. He faced the same darkness, the same alpha pressure to never show weakness. But here is where the two fates began to separate. Hollywood loves a rebel, but it only protects the ones who can still show up for work on Monday morning. Patrick recognized his fragility. He sought help. He leaned into the structure of his work. Jan, however, pushed against the very system that was feeding him. He began to be seen, not as a legend, but as a liability. In an industry built on insurance bonds and shooting schedules, unpredictable is the most dangerous word you can have attached to your name. The greatest difference between these two men wasn't their talent, it was their fortress. Success in Hollywood is a desert. If you don't have a source of water, you will dry up. Patrick Swayze spent 34 years building his fortress. His marriage to Lisa Niemi was more than a Hollywood romance. It was a military-grade defense system. She was his gatekeeper, his rock, and his protector. There was someone there to catch him. Jan-Michael Vincent had a void. His personal life was a revolving door of turbulent marriages, restraining orders, and public blow-ups. He didn't build a fortress. He burned bridges as fast as he crossed them. He lived the lone wolf archetype to the extreme. But the lone wolf is always the first one to be picked off when the winter comes. Jan spent his life trying to prove he was a god who needed no one. And gods don't have support systems. They only have worshippers. And worshippers are the first to leave when the temple starts to crumble. For an action star, the body is the contract. And in 1996, the contracts for both men began to bleed. For Jan-Michael Vincent, 1996 was the definitive game over. A catastrophic car accident broke his neck and permanently damaged his vocal cords. The hero of Airwolf literally lost his voice. The man whose physicality was his currency was suddenly bankrupt. He retreated into a raspy whisper and a bottle of vodka, disappearing into the shadows of small-town life. Patrick Swayze was also facing the physical toll of his career. He was constantly injured, shattered legs, torn tendons, the price of doing his own stunts. But while John was retreating, Patrick was reinventing. He moved from hunk to actor. He took roles that demanded soul instead of muscle. One man was fighting the cruelty of time by leaning into it. The other was trying to outrun it in a fast car. By the late 90s, Hollywood's response was clear. For Patrick, the system adapted. His reputation for professionalism bought him patience. For January, tolerance had thinned to nothing. The calls stopped. The invitations faded. He was no longer a star. He was a cautionary tale. Then came the moment when the body becomes a prison. In 2008, Patrick Swayze was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. It is a death sentence. Most men would have hidden away. Patrick didn't. He went to work. He filmed the series The Beast while undergoing chemotherapy, refusing to take heavy pain medication because he didn't want it to dull his performance. He chose to stand in the light even as it was fading. Meanwhile, in Mississippi, Jan-Michael Vincent was facing his own amputation. His leg was gone due to infection. His fortune was gone. His memory was failing. Look at the contrast. Patrick Swayze facing certain death, standing tall on a film set, surrounded by respect. Jan-Michael Vincent facing a slow decay, hiding behind a blanket in a wheelchair, surrounded by silence. One man was holding onto his spirit with both hands. The other had been sitting in the dark for a long time. It wasn't about money or fame anymore. It was about dignity. Hollywood rarely delivers cruelty with a confrontation. It prefers distance. When a star becomes a liability, there is no final conversation. Access simply disappears. For Patrick, the industry framed his struggle as courage. Tributes followed. His work was recontextualized as the effort of a warrior. The system knew how to hold him because he had played by the rules of the system. Jan-Michael Vincent experienced the invisible abandonment. As his standing weakened, the willingness of the industry to intervene vanished. Concern was replaced by caution. Hollywood doesn't blacklist most people, it simply stops investing. And once that investment stops, narratives harden. Mistakes are remembered longer than achievements. Past brilliance becomes a footnote. The applause didn't stop for Jan because the audience turned away. It stopped because no one cued it. He was a person standing where attention used to be. And in the silence, he became a ghost long before he actually died. The 14th of September 2009, Patrick Swayze's death was a global event. It was a hero's send-off. He left behind a die-sin, a legacy of courage. He proved that even when fate wins the battle, you can still win the war for your reputation. He died with his boots on. He died as a king. February 2019. Jan-Michael Vincent's death was a whisper in an empty room. He had been dead to the world for 20 years already. He was a man whose neighbors didn't even know he was Stringfellow Hawk. When the heart of the highest-paid man on television finally stopped, the world didn't stop with him. No actors posted tributes that day. No fans gathered at his Hollywood star, because no one knew. It took a month for the news to break. One man is remembered for how he lived. The other is remembered for what he lost. Both gave Hollywood exactly what it asked for: their youth, their bodies, and their beauty. But when the fantasy broke, only one was held in the light long enough to say goodbye. Why does this tragedy matter to us today? Because we were the ones who built the pedestal. We are the ones who demand our icons be invincible. We celebrate the light, but we grow uneasy when they remind us of our own fragility. Jan-Michael Vincent didn't vanish because we forgot him. He faded because remembering him was too uncomfortable. He was the reminder that charisma doesn't protect you, and that decline can happen without a script. Patrick Swayze's legacy allows us to remember the dream. Jan's life forces us to acknowledge the cost. But their story is not the end of the pattern. In fact, if you look closely at the history of the 90 Seconds It Girls, you will see the same fate beginning to take hold of another icon. A woman who was the most beautiful face of 1992. A woman who, like Jan, walked away from a multi-million-dollar career after a single, devastating night. A woman whose current photos are being used to shock the world, just as Jan's once were. You think you've seen the price of fame? You haven't seen the vanishing. Click the video on your screen right now to see the next chapter in our Tragedy and Fate series, the story of the woman who died while she was still at the top, and the secret she's been hiding for 30 years. The pattern is waiting. Are you?